Welcome to this third video in a beginner's guide to Rails 7. In this video, we're going to create a controller from scratch, which means we're going to repeat everything we did in the first video. But this time, instead of using the scaffolding to create everything for us, we're going to create it on our own. And the reason we're doing this is, one, to learn better how Rails works, and two, sometimes the scaffold creates so much code that we'd end up spending more time customizing that code to get exactly what we want than we would if we just built the controller on our own. Before we begin, we need to talk about RESTful routing. So routing is all about taking the URL and connecting that with a controller and action that we should call to respond to a request. Rails uses RESTful routing, and to figure out what RESTful routing is, there's four basic operations that we would do with a database table. One, we would create a row, we can read a row, update a row, and delete a row. And that's commonly referred to as CRUD. So we have those four operations that we would do on a row. With having it as a website, we do have a couple of more operations. One, we need a form to fill out so we can create a row. So this is one action. It gives the user a form to create a row, and the next action will actually create the row. And also we need a form to update or edit our database entity as well. And also there is two kinds of reads. One read where we might read one thing out of the database, and another read where we might read many things out of our database. For example, we might look at a single blog post, but we also might go to the home page and see all of the blog posts. So in total, there's 7 different actions that we would do with this database table if we count the 2 forms to create and update a row, and also one more action to read many rows instead of reading just one row. And RESTful routing is all about using the HTTP verb to specify what we want to do to our database. So if we use the get action verb in HTTP, that means we want to read something. If we use the post, that means we want to create something. Patch means we want to update something, and delete means we want to delete something. So keeping that in mind, you'll probably need to go to your config routes file. There's a little URL up there. You can visit that site and read more about RESTful routing. So the first thing we're going to do is create our model file, and we can use the generator to create that model for us. So just like in the first video when we used the generator to create our scaffolding, but in this case, we're only going to create a model. Now here, it's very important that we use the singular name of our model, so task, just one task, and not the plural name. Now that's called inflections, singular to plural, and Rails is really good with inflections. Even all the exceptions, it kind of has built in. It's not perfect though, so if you do have a model where the name Rails doesn't guess the plural right, then you can, in your configuration folder, you'll find an inflections file where you can set it straight and say the singular task, the plural is tasks. But Rails, this is an easy one. Well, Rails will automatically know that task is the singular name and tasks with an S is a plural name. When you generate your model, pretty much always you want to make sure you use the singular name, not the plural. And just like we did with the scaffolding, we're going to have a name. We could put the string type on that, but by default, it will be a string. So we can do a due date, and that is a date time, and then a priority that is an integer. And so we could go ahead and run that. And just like before, it creates us a migration file. It creates our model file and some test files. So let's go ahead and open up this migration file in our editor. And that is in the DB folder. So you got your app folder, and then but not even in the app folder, it's in the DB folder. Underneath the migrate folder, you'll find your migration. Now, once again, if you check this into your GitHub repository and you're working with other people, you got to assume that other people have pulled down your changes and run this migration. Once other people run the migration, you need to create a new migration to fix any errors. So it does save you a lot of headache if you go through and look and make sure you spelled everything correctly before you run the migration and before you commit this into your GitHub repository. Um, I'm pretty sure that's okay. So now we'll run our migration by Rails DB migrate. So that will run the code, and now it created the table for us. So with the model view controller design pattern that we're using, the model should be UI independent, meaning it doesn't matter what user interface we use. Basically, our models contain all our data and the actions that we want to perform on that data. And this task model that was created for us is pretty much UI independent. In fact, we can go ahead and interact with it in what's called the Rails console. So if we do bin Rails C, or a console if we want to type it all out, either one. When we do that, we enter into the console. So this loads up all of our code and we can interact with the task. And this can be kind of considered a user interface for our task model. It's not a very good one because the user will need to learn Ruby to be able to interact with our model. But since we're developing our web application, we need to know how to interact with this model, meaning how do we create one, how do we update it, how do we delete it, and so on. So to create a model, we just say t equals a task.new. And this is the Ruby way of calling a constructor. So we're going to construct or instantiate a new task. And when we just print it out, we can see all of the fields are nil. Task.name is nil, and so on. The other thing is the task, we can ask, are you persisted? And that means, are you saved in the database? And it's going to say, no, I'm not saved in the database. So it knows it's not saved in the database. If we're to exit out of this console, this task will just disappear, it get garbage collected. The only way to make it persisted is to save it in the database. So we have to tell the task to save himself in the database. But before we do that, let's go ahead and give him a name. And we'll say it's a console task. And a due date. And his due date will be time.zone.now. So that means it's due right now. So now it's already late. Priority, and we'll say the priority is 3. Okay, and now we can say, why don't you save, or at least try to save yourself in the database? And we can see it generates a SQL statement right here, and it goes ahead and saves it in the database, and it returns true, saying, yep, I've been saved in the database. So when we exit our console, and now we're back on the command line, that task is persisted now because it's saved in the database. So the next thing we'll do is we'll re-enter the console. And now that we've re-entered the console, we can go task equals our task. And instead of creating a new one from scratch, we'll get the first task out of our database. So this is a class method, meaning we call it on the class. And you might think of those as static methods if you come from the Java world. So this is a class method that we call on the task. And it will write a SQL statement to find the first task in our database and pull it out. And now we can see, press T, and we have the console task. It has a due date and a priority, and even the created and updated app fields were added in. You can also see it's been assigned an ID, and we can see, hey, are you persisted? And it says, yes, I am persisted. Now we can even say t.name. Let's say this is an edited console task now. And so now the name is different, but the only thing is it's just the task in memory. If we want to make sure these changes are saved, then we have to go t.save again. And this time, because it knows it was already in the database and it has an ID, now it knows how to write a SQL statement to update itself in the database. So now we can do the update. We can also do task.all, And this gets all of the tasks out of the database. Right now we only have one, but if you see the square brackets here, this is an array of tasks. So if we create another task, and let's see, t2.name equals second console task, and then t2.priority equals 4, and we won't set the due date, but now we can go t2.save, and it's saved in the database. And now when we go task.all, it gives us all the tasks. We can also go task.first, which will give us the, task.first, will give us the first task out, and then we can also go task.last, and it writes a SQL statement and gets us the last task out. Now, we still have T2 on memory because I haven't quit the console yet, but if you notice it has an ID, it knows it's in the database. What if we want to delete it? We could go t2.destroy, and then it writes a SQL statement and it deletes himself out of the database. The next thing we want to do is add some validation. So we're going to validate the name field, and we're going to make sure, just like before, we're going to make sure that there is at least a name in our model. So we can also add a validates the priority, and this just makes sure the priority is greater than 0. So also validate the due date and make sure they've set a due date. So let's go ahead and test this out in our console. So we can restart our console, and we can go t equals a task.new. And we're getting this error. So whenever you get an error, you just make sure you find the actual error you're getting. And it's saying unknown validator, numericality validator. So this is unknown. So you might want to go back to the documentation or your Rails search and make sure you're spelling it right. And if you notice up here, I added a extra B. So we'll save that. And now we can try rerunning our task.new, and that worked. So let's go ahead and try to go task.save, and it says false, so that means it cannot save this in a database. And now you can try to figure out why we can't save it in the database by looking at the errors, and you can see that the name is blank, and there are other errors. The priority is not a number, and the due date is also blank. So we have all of those errors that have been put onto this record. Now, with this validation, we're going to send this model back with all the errors, and we're going to reprint out a form. And the form will use this same model, detect these errors, and highlight the fields that need to be fixed. So one other thing that we might want to do is we might want to make sure the due date is in the future. Now, unfortunately, Rails doesn't have a validator that validates the future or pastness of a date. So we have to write our own, and I'll paste in this code here. And we're writing our own method here. It validates due date in the future. Now we need to make sure the due date is present, because if not, it's nil, and then we try to call past on nil, and that will crash. But if the due date is present and the due date is in the past, we're going to add an error onto the due date field, and this is the message that will show up on our form, telling the user they have to put the due date into the future. Now, to make sure that this custom validation gets run when we save, we have to add this validate, and notice the S is missing here because these are built-in validations, and we're able to identify the field we want to. And this validate means, hey, just call this method. This method will add errors if it detects something wrong. So now we can try doing that. Now, this task model that we pulled out unfortunately doesn't have the changes. When we save this file, it doesn't pick up those changes. So a lot of times it's a really good idea to just exit out of your console and re-enter into the console so that we get the fresh code that we just changed. So whenever you're doing something in a console and you save something but things aren't changing, just exit the console, re-enter it in, and try it again. So now we go t equals task.new. And now we have the task. So let's go ahead and try to add some fields. So we'll do the name, and we'll say validated task. And we'll go due date priority, and we'll say equals -1, which should cause an error. And then we'll also say t.due date equals time.zone.now -2 hours. So this is a cool little thing. Numbers or integers in Ruby have this method added onto it where hours, and it will automatically subtract the right amount of hours from our due date. So now we saved that or added that to our field. And now when we go t.save, and now we could say, well, what errors do we have? And you can see that the due date can't be in the past, so that error was added on. And also our priority is not greater than 0. So we could go ahead and change those. We'll do t.priority equals 2, and t.due date equals time.zone.now, and then we'll go plus 2 hours instead of 2 hours in the past, and we'll try to save that, and it saves. One thing I might add on to this priority is a presence validator, and let's make it our messages a little bit better. So if they don't put any priority, it'll say it's blank or it can't be blank. And then if they do put a priority that's negative, then it will say it's not greater than 0. If we didn't have this in, then the message would say, hey, the priority is not a number. And that might be a little bit confusing because they're like, well, I didn't give a priority. So this will be a little bit more user-friendly. Okay, so now that we have all of our model complete, it's time to work on our user interface, which is, of course, our website. And we need to create a controller that's going to interact with our model and choose the right views that will send it back to our users. So to create this controller, we're going to use the generator. So bin rels g, which is short for generate. And this time we're going to create another controller, and we're going to call this the tasks controller. Now, just pointing out, now we're using the plural version because this controller manages many tasks, or all the tasks. And for now, we'll just create an index action. And just like when we created our sites controller, is going to create the controller file for us. It's going to create a route, which we'll need to edit. It's also going to create a tasks folder for our views and the index view because we put an index action up there. We can also see that it created a helper for us, and it's also creating some test files as well, which we're not going to do anything with. So let's first go into our routes file and update the route that it automatically generated for us. So in the config folder in the routes file, we can delete the route that the generator generated for us, and we can replace that with the resources and tasks. Now what this does is it maps all 7 of those actions I talked about in the beginning of the video to different methods inside of our tasks controller. So the one, if you want to read more about the RESTful routing, you can look at this URL, and it will explain everything you want to know about routing in Rails. And the first action that we'll worry about is the index action. So the URL from that is /tasks, and it is supposed to list out all of the tasks that are in the database. So let's go ahead and go to our controller file, our brand new task controller that has this index action. And in here, we want to pull out all the tasks out of the database. So that's task.all. Remember, I did that in the console. And we're just going to save that as an instance variable on this controller so that we can use that in our forms. So remember the @ sign in front of this variable name adds this as an instance variable onto this controller, which will allow us to use this tasks variable in our forms. So make sure we save both of those files. And now we can go edit the view here. And we have, in this task view, we have this view. And since we already set up this title helper, we can set the title, and we can say tasks. And then what we want to do is say for or at tasks, that same variable that I set up, each, and we're going to do a little loop for that. So we'll call this a task. So for each task, and now in this here, if you notice there's no equal sign in here, that's because this part is not printing anything else. It's just the start of the loop. And we could add a div tag, and the ID equals, and go back into Rails mode here, and the ID we'll just call the DOM ID method and pass the task in. And that will basically just generate the string task underscore ID, and we'll print it out. We'll also add a class here for our task, and we'll just call this tasks, or a task class. And then we can print out all the information about the task. So this should be good. Let's go ahead and see what it looks like on our website. We're just printing out the due date and the priority and the name. So now we can view that page by going to the URL/tasks. And we see all of our tasks on the page. Now it would be nice if we had a link up here that goes to our tasks instead of hoping our users guess the right URL to put on the end. So let's go ahead and put that link in there. The navigation bar is in our views, in our app views application.html file. And this is what we set up in the previous video. And we already wrote this nav link helper, so it makes it really easy to add a new navigation link onto our page. So we'll make the text that we want to have show up is tasks, and we want that to go to the tasks path. Now you might wonder where this tasks path, where this is defined, and this is actually created by the resources tasks up here. So not only does this map the URLs to the controller actions, but it also generates some helper methods to automatically generate these paths. So by refreshing, we now have tasks in the navigation bar, and it's even highlighted because that's the page you're on. Next, let's add a link or a button here to create a new task. So back in our tasks index view, we can add that link in by using the link to helper. And this will go to the new task path. And this is another helper, just like the tasks path. This is another helper that will generate the link to create a new task. And we can also style up this link and make it look like a button instead of a link by adding the button class and the button primary onto it. And we'll also surround it in a paragraph tag. And now we have the new task button right here, and we can click on it, and you can see that the URL is /tasks/new. But we're getting an error. It says the new action cannot be found in the task controller. So let's create that method now. So inside of our task controller, we can add this new method in. And all we need to do in here is create a brand new empty task. Now remember, from the console, this doesn't actually create and save a task in the database. It just creates it in memory. And we're going to use this task just to kind of create our form for the user to fill in to create a new task. And now let's refresh. And now it's complaining that there's a missing template for this page. And that's because in this tasks folder, it doesn't know which view to use because there's no file called new. So we can go ahead and create a new file in this task. This is the views tasks folder. And we'll go new.html.erb. And in this one, we can create a title. And we'll just say create a task. And then we need a form. So we could go form with, and we'll do a model. And this is a form generator that Ruby gives us, and the model is that empty task model that we created in the controller. And then we can do that. And so this will generate us a form tag with all the stuff we need to be able to create and submit this form. And now we can add an input field, say f.text. And we have the name of the task, and then we also have the priority and the due date that we want to do. But let's just see how our form looks up to this point. So refreshing, we have this. Of course, we need to have a label here, but we can use Bootstrap, the one that's styling up our website, to make this form look a little bit better. So if we go to the documents and we scroll down here, there's a full section about all the forms that all the information about creating forms. So we can look in here and you can see that there's quite a lot of HTML that we have to create just for some form fields to be able to show up on our page. And that kind of seems like a lot of work. And this is the one thing that, doing with PHP, with just straight PHP, is you end up typing out a lot of HTML just for your forms. And I want something really simple and easy. So luckily, there is a gem, and a gem is a Ruby library that we can use that will help us generate these forms really quickly. And that's the Bootstrap form gem. And you can read through all of this documentation. It tells you exactly everything that you can do. You can see that this little bit of code right here will generate all of this HTML. And this looks a lot easier to type in than something this big. So if we read through our installation, we have to install this gem in our gem file. So now we have we just paste in that Bootstrap form gem into our gem file. Now the gem file lists all of the libraries that we're going to use with our application. It even includes the Rails framework inside of it. So we just copy and paste that. Now it's important that we stop our server because the server will not pick up these changes automatically. And then we have to run a command called bundle to install our new libraries that we've added in. And now once that's installed, we can start our server again. And if we don't do that, then what happens is Rails will not pick up this new library, and when we try to use Bootstrap form, it won't work. And now we can just follow this simple example here to create our form. So we'll have a date time field for the due date, a number field for the priority, and a submit button. And when we refresh, we have all of these fields set up. Now we can make this button a different color by using, instead of f.submit, we can do f.primary. And we could go ahead and try to create a new task. So we'll go finish TaskController, and we'll set the due date sometime in the future. And this is our number one priority. And we also have to have the time as well. And we can see that nothing is happening. Now, normally we'd see the error that's causing that for nothing to happen on the web page, but because this is kind of getting submitted through Ajax and Turbo Links, which is a cool library that Rails has, and maybe we'll talk about that in the future, we can look into the logs and find out that the action create could not be found. So going back to our task controller, we have to create that create method, just like we did with new. And what we could do is we could say at task equals, we're going to create a new task. Now we can't use the task that we created in the new action because the new action draws up the form and sends it back to the user, and then it's done and all of memory gets wiped out for that response. So this task just disappears. Now we never saved it in the database, so we won't have empty tasks in our database, but this task is just deleted out of memory. So we have to create a new task. And what we'd probably do next is we'd probably say the task.name is equal to our params, And our params have a task that's attached to it, and then the name right there. And then we also have to set our due date and our priority. Now you can see that the name of this name input field up here is name equals task, and then we have the brackets, these square brackets with name inside of it. So that's a way that Ruby or Ruby on Rails kind of names these fields and how it puts those fields into the parameters. And that's why we do params task and then a name inside of there. It's kind of like a double array. And now that would be kind of a lot of work. What if we have like 10 fields and we'd have to do 10 assignments? And that gets a little boring and tedious. So of course, Ruby on Rails decides a faster way to do it where we could just pass in the params a task. Now this is what we call mass assignment. It takes everything that was in the task, the name, the due date, and the priority, and it just mass assigns it to this new task. We can pass that in to the new method, and the new method will just assign it. Now, mass assignment is great, but it does come with a little security hole. It doesn't really apply in this case, but people on the web can add additional fields into our task, and our mass assignment would assign those into our task. And if this were, say, a user, they could maybe change their admin status and other stuff. So for that, we need to take our params and protect it. So we're going to require that there be a task and only permit the name, due date, and priority fields. So what this does is it kind of whitelists and says only assign these fields to this task. Now this could get a little bit redundant, so what we can do is create a private method. And this is how we create a private method. We put the private keyword there, and we're going to create a method called our task params. And we're going to use this in our update method as well, and we're just going to return that we typed in, and now we could say task params here. So we call the method, it makes sure that only the fields we want to get assigned to this new task get assigned. So now that we have all the fields assigned, the next thing we want to do is see if we can save this task in the database. Now, if all the validations pass, then this task will get saved in the database. And if some of the validations don't pass, then it won't get saved. So in here we have errors, usually validation errors. But if it is saved, then what we'll do, we don't really need to draw up a web page and send it back to the user. We could just send the user back to this index action. So what we'll do is we'll say redirect the user to the tasks path with a notice saying task created. Okay, so this is using those flash messages, and you might be wondering what a redirect is. And what a redirect does is instead of sending a page full of HTML content, when someone submits the form, the page usually will come back. But a redirect says, you know what, the page you're looking for really isn't here. We've temporarily moved it, and what the browser will do is when it gets that the temporary redirection, the browser will generate a new request that will request the index action. So it's not a method call up here. We actually send something back to the browser, and that calls the browser to request the tasks path. And because we've saved this notice, it actually saves it in a session cookie. When it comes back, they'll see the task created. So let's see that in action. So we'll click Create Task, and now we're on the index page, and it says Task Created. And now hopefully you see why we created these flash messages, because this is really nice. We actually give some useful content back, not just a single page saying the task was created, and they can see it there. Now let's go ahead and try to create a new task that doesn't get saved in the database. You can see nothing really happened. It just says no content here. So there really wasn't an error. It's just that we didn't have any content. Now, in this case, if the task isn't saved, what we want to do is send them back to this new method so they can fix their errors. But there's no way that we could take all the stuff they gave us, like all the stuff they typed in to the form, and then have it reappear there. So we're actually not going to even call this method. We're just going to choose the view. We're going to tell the create method is going to say, hey, render this new view. And of course, we could call it create, but that would be extra work. We'd have two of them. So all we have to do is say render new, and this isn't a method call up to here. It's not calling that method. It's just choosing this as a view. And if you notice, the task that we had tried to save is the same name as this task in the new view. So our form that's going to use this task is going to see that it has errors. And also, this is new for Rails 7, is we actually have to tell, and this is a turbo links thing that's kind of new and integrated into Rails 7. We have to tell or set our status. And so what this does is it sends back a special status code in our HTTP response that lets TurboLinks know that this form was not able to submit. And so now when I click Create Task, we see all the errors show up. And that's because those validation errors are attached to this Create Task model. But it would be nice to have a little error message up here, just kind of saying we couldn't save this because of the errors below. So we have this alert message that's part of the Bootstrap gem that we installed. And we can just add in a message here saying, please fix the errors below. And this error summary would, if we set this to true, it would actually list out all the errors that were on the task. But since they're already highlighted in the form, we don't need it. So let's save that. And clicking Create Task again, we see this, please fix the errors below. And we can see all of the errors that we need to fix. And if we set our priority, let's try setting our due date in the past. And we'll call this an error task. And we could see that error message is saying, hey, it can't be in the past. So let's go ahead and set it to the future again. And we click the create task and it creates the task. So it'd be nice to have a link on each one of these tasks to be able to click the link and see each individual task. So that's pretty easy to do. We're already printing out the task's name. All we have to do is make this a link by using the link to helper method. And the URL that we want it to link to, we could just use task. Now this is some pretty nifty Rails magic. Basically, it asks this object, hey, what kind of object are you? And it says, I'm a task object. And because of all the conventions, Ruby or Ruby on Rails is going to say, well, is there a tasks path or a task path? And it's going to automatically generate the URL to view this single task. So we'll refresh, and now each one of these is a link to see each task. So I'll go ahead and click on this link. Of course, the show action could not be found for the task controller. So all we need to do is create that show method. And in this show method, we want to be able to load the task out of the database. So task.find this time, because the task is already in the database. To load it out, we want to do a find. And the params will have an ID field in it. That way we can use the task ID to figure out or to pull this task out of the database. Now we also are going to have to create a view for this. So let's go ahead and do a new file here, and we'll say show.html.erb. And in this show method, we can go ahead and set the title. And we could say something like view task here. And what I really want to do is I want this code right here to be here. Now, copying and pasting code is usually not a good idea. Of course, sometimes we do it anyway, but Rails has a better way, and this is where we can create a partial. So we'll go ahead and create a new file, and we'll call this the task.html.erb. And in this new file, I'm going to go to the index page, and I'm going to cut all of that out, and I'm going to save it right here in the partial. Now in Ruby on Rails, any view that starts with an underscore means it's a partial. Now back in this index view, we can just put a render, and we can just say the task. And now here is, again, some Rails magic. It asks this object, what kind of object are you? And it says, hey, I'm a task object. So it says, oh, gee, I wonder if there's a view for tasks. So it looks for the tasks folder inside of our views and looks for a partial that's named task. So it's not the variable name, it's actually the class type. And it will go ahead and link that up and draw that up. So in our show view, all we need to do is call that render method again. And this time we need to do @task. And that's because in our task controller, the @task is the variable we used. Versus the index, we're looping through an array of tasks and we're calling each one task. And that's why we're using task without the @ in the index view. So let's see if all that works. So we refresh on our show action and we have that. We can go and see all of our tasks and they're both working and they're using the same view or the same partial. Now the only thing is since we're just viewing one task, we have this link here and it just goes back to itself. By the way, just take a notice at the path up here, we have tasks/1, that's the ID of the task. So back in our controller, that's the ID that this is going to use to try to find the task. Let's go ahead and fix that link problem. We want the link when the task is on the index page, but we don't want the link when we're seeing just one task. So how do we do that? Well, there is another helpful method called link to unless current. So what this will do is see if the path we're on is the same path as this, and if it is, then it won't make it a link, but it will still print out the text. And so now when we refresh, the link disappears, but when we go back to all the tasks, then all the links show up. Now, of course, it would be nice to have a little back link here so that we go back and view all tasks. And we don't want to put that in the partial or else the link will show up in the index page as well. So we'll just put that link here and show, and we could just say link to, and we'll say all tasks. And the path will be our tasks, plural path, because this is a link to see all of our tasks. And we refresh and we can link back to all of our tasks. So the last two things we need to do is be able to edit a task and delete a task. So let's just put an edit link here so that we can go to a form to edit our task. There we can, let's do another link to helper. And it's the edit task path. And of course we have to pass in the task so it knows what ID to use for the URL to make it, and we can separate those with a little bar. And refreshing, we have the edit task path. Now I just realized that this row, this class row, adds the flex property onto the div tag, which makes those links get separated into multiple lines. So this is my application layout file. If I delete the row and refresh, well, now we get these links all in one line. So go ahead and click on this edit task, and we can see the edit action could not be found for the task controller. So let's add that action. So back in the task controller, we'll create a edit method. And we want to do the same thing we do in the show method is we need to pull the task out of the database because what we want to do is present a form to the user to edit. And we want the form already filled in with all of the data that was saved in the database for this task. So we need to pull the task out of the database, and now we can generate a form to edit this task. Now we are kind of repeating ourselves. We have this same line of code both in our show and our edit. actions. We're going to need it in our update and our destroy actions as well. So that's a lot of repeating ourselves. So let's go ahead and put that code in a method called load task. And we'll just take this out and put it in this method. And then we could just call load task here. And then it would set this at task variable inside of our class. And we'd also do that in our show method, but again, now we just swapped one line of code for another line of code. And it might be easier to use a filter. Now a filter is basically a method that gets called. Whenever we call the show method, before we call the show method, we can have it call another method. And we do this with before action. Now, before action only works on task control or in controllers that inherit from application controller. But this method means before we call any of these methods, call the load task first so we can set the task and then call the show or the edit. That way, we don't have to call anything inside of these methods. Now, there is one problem. It'll call it on the index, the new, and the create actions, and there will be no ID in those actions. That actually will crash those actions. So we need to do an except here, and we don't want to call the load action or the load task before a new, index, or create actions. And make sure we put colons in front of those. They're symbols. And what that means is now before the show and the edit method that we will call the load task. And we'll set this variable. So we'll pull the task out of the database and we'll have it here in this instance variable. So now if we refresh, we can see that we're missing the template. We don't have our view yet. So let's go ahead and create our view, the same name as our method. So we'll just create a new file here that says edit.html.erb. Now in here we can say, why don't we edit task as the title. And what we need is pretty much the same form that we have in our new view. So we could be tempted to copy and paste this form into our edit. And that would actually work. But again, copy and pasting is not good usually. So we'll go ahead and instead create a partial called form.html.erb. That way we can take the form that's in our new action or our new view, and we'll cut that out and we'll paste it inside of this partial here that will have the form. Now we can use this partial both in the new view, and because this isn't the task partial, this is just a partial that we created. Just by using the same name as our string, it will look for it there and find it. Make sure you also have the equal sign there. If you miss that, then it doesn't print anything else on the page. So we'll save that new one. We can copy and paste this into our edit. And now we'll have the form both on our new page and our edit page. So let's see what that looks like. And refreshing our edit, notice we have our task that's been pulled out of the database. It has all the data filled in. We can go back to all tasks here, and we can try a new task, and we have a form that's blank. Now this one thing that we need to look at when we edit this task, the user is going to get confused because it says create task in our form, whereas they're not creating the task, they're updating the task. So if we look at our form partial, you notice it says create task. Of course, if I change this to say update task, then on the new view, they'll get confused because they're creating a task instead of updating one. So what we can do is we can ask, is this task variable persisted? So this returns true or false. True if it's been saved in the database. And in that case, we want it to say update task. Okay, so this is the ternary operator. We have this question mark. So if this is true, then we want to return update task. And if it's false, then we want to say create task. So if it's not saved in the database, then it will say create task. If it's already been saved in the database, then it will say update task because we're trying to edit it. And again, this is the ternary operator. It's an if statement in one line. Pretty useful to keep our code small. And so now we'll refresh, and now it says update task. And if we go to create a new task, it will say create task. So now that we got that working, let's go ahead and try to update one of our tasks. And since we're now doing the editing on the web, let's call this an edited web task. And let's see what happens when I click this update task. And if you notice, it doesn't seem like anything happened. Now, if we go back in our logs on our web server, we see that we're getting this error, and it's actually saying the update could not be found. Now, the reason why the web page doesn't show this is because we're using Turbo, and Turbo's trying to load the page using Ajax behind the scenes to make page load seem faster. So anyway, to fix it, we need to add the update action. So back in our task controller, the first thing that we would want to do is load the task out of the database, but that's already going to happen because we already have the before action set up. And it's going to call the load task before the show edit, and now this new method update, because update isn't in the exception list. So we already have the task variable, and all we have to do is try to go task.update, and we're going to update it with the task params. And these task params are the same. This basically calling this method is the same method that we used for the create when we created a new task. And so when we do that, we can just see if this is successful. So this will go ahead and try to update it and see if it works. And if it updates it and saves it in the database, then we just want to redirect to, and we can just redirect to the task. We could do a couple of things. We could take them to the tasks path where we have the list of all of our tasks, or we can direct it to the task that we just updated, so they see the new task that's been updated. And we can even do another shortcut with this. We can just go at task right there, and then it'll go to view, the show view of that task, and we'll give a notice saying the task was updated. Okay, now what happens if the task doesn't get saved? Well, we want to do the same thing that we did in create. It's if we want to render the edit. Now again, this is not calling this edit method right here. It's just choosing the edit view, and the edit view will drop a form using this task that could not get saved in the database. And so we also need the status unprocessable entity. And what that will do is it will help Turbo catch the error and give us an error page back. So let's go ahead and delete the title, see what happens. Hey, you have to fix the errors. We got to send this guy back into the future. And we'll just say edited web task. And we'll update the task, and now it's updated. So the last thing we need to do is create a way for them to delete the task. So on the show view, we'll add a delete button. So back here, and in this case, we have to use a button too, and we say delete task. And the path that we want to go to is the task path. So we could just do at task, or we could, if we wanted to type some more, we can do task path like this and then pass in the task. Either way, we'll create a path to delete this task. Now, because we want to delete, using the RESTful routing, we have to do this method delete. We have to send a delete request. And let's go ahead and also add some styling, make this look like a little nicer button. So BTN and BTN secondary. And we might want to change the color to a red color so it stands out as dangerous more, but we'll just do this for now. And we'll refresh, and now we have this button, and we click at that, and of course nothing happened because we don't have a delete action set up. So we have the action destroy could not be found. But another thing, if the person accidentally clicks on it, it would be nice to give them a chance to cancel that out. So we can actually add with some little JavaScript. The JavaScript's already built in. We just have to add the right thing. So on the form, so this button creates a form for us, and on that form, we can have the data tag, and inside of there, there's a turbo confirm, and we can say, are you sure? And what that will do will make sure it'll put something on our form, so when before they click it, it will pop up a confirmation box to see if they really want to destroy this task. So we'll go ahead and refresh, and we'll click delete task. It says, are you sure? And we can cancel out of that, or we can click OK, but still nothing's happened because we haven't implemented the destroy action yet. So back in our task controller, we can go ahead and add the destroy method in here. And because destroy is not in this exception list, it's going to load the task out of our database. So now with that task loaded, we could just go task.destroy, and that will delete the task. We already have the confirmation. So now we just need to send the user to somewhere. So the best place to send them would be the tasks path. That's the list of all of our tasks. And this time maybe we can use an alert saying task was deleted. And so let's go ahead and try that. So we'll go ahead and refresh. We'll click this delete task. Are you sure? Cancel, that doesn't do anything. And delete task, and we click OK. And now we're on this page. That task is gone, and we can see the task was deleted. So that's all of our 7 actions built. So now we have done everything that the scaffolding has done, but we built it on our own. Again, the scaffolding might have been nice for this one, because we're doing exactly what it does. But as we see in the next video, we're going to do some different things when we have relationships between tasks. And in the next video, the scaffolding would take more time, I think, to go through and edit everything to make it work than it would by building everything from scratch.